This is a video on how to go about making an illustration for your comic or novel. Let's get straight into it. I'll be dividing the process into 5 steps: theme, mood, composition, drawing, and finally, final touches. Part 1 will cover the less practical bits, and Part 2 will cover the drawing process. A cover, according to me, should be personal and should reflect what your story is about. It's going to draw attention to your story as it's the first impression that the viewer will have. In this tutorial, I'll only be talking about flat illustrations, so you don't have to worry about rendering. Let's get started. The first thing that I would like you to ask yourself is what the story is about. Is the genre action, a romance, or perhaps something more abstract? Figuring this out can really help you find a direction for the illustration. Here are some questions that you can ask yourself. What's the genre of my story? What's the main theme of my story? And what do I want to show or convey? I'll be following along with an example illustration to help you navigate through this process. The genre of my story is slice of life and the theme is acceptance and growth. With that in mind, I should be making something lighthearted, but I want it to be messy. If you're working on an action story, you can go for a more dynamic illustration that really shows what the story is about. What you want to show or convey is what will shape the illustration. Is there any important event in the story that you want to show? For example, a child learning to grow a plant or a character going berserk. In contrast, you might want to just introduce the protagonist or a set of new characters. Maybe your story revolves around a setting. In those cases, illustration showing the world would be a good choice. This would be a good route for sci-fi or fantasy stories or stories with prominent settings like an apocalyptic world. Take your time deciding what you feel does the most justice to your story. You show the mood of a story by selecting the right colors. A good color palette can really convey emotions. When selecting colors for an illustration, here are some general things that you can keep in mind. Warm colors can give a sense of compassion and feel comforting, while cool colors feel distant and calm. Bright colors can be fun and playful, and muted colors are more subtle and peaceful. For example, this illustration gives a happier vibe in bright colors than it does in blues. Similarly, the same illustration in pink feels more soft and loving, and in green it gives a more peaceful vibe. Color schemes can make an illustration feel more uniform. For example, contrasting colors can be more impactful and show two worlds colliding. They're often used to show parallels and make the illustration feel more vibrant. Contrasting colors that I discussed earlier are known as complementary colors. Further, we have triadic colors that are evenly spaced out on the color wheel. Often, one of them is used as the main color and the other two are used as accents. Analogous colors are next to each other. They bring a sense of harmony and are often seen in nature. Experiment with different color palettes and schemes. Don't be scared to try combinations that you usually would not. An important thing to remember is don't be afraid of failure. Get playful with your choices. It doesn't have to look perfect. In my experience, not playing it safe usually brings out the best colors. Composition. Composition is the more fun part of the process. This is where you decide what the illustration will look like. You can divide this into 3 categories: items, personality, and interests. Items are metaphors or any relevant things. This can also include the setting. Personality will determine the colors, mood, and it will consist of more abstract stuff. Interests are characters' hobbies, their tastes, and what defines them. If there is no specific character, interests can just be important elements or things that define the story. I added elements that I felt were what made the protagonist who they are. You can see people and things important to him spilling out of his head. I like to be straightforward with my ideas, but the mirror for self-reflection might have been too straightforward. But everyone approaches stories and ideas differently, so just have fun trying new things. We've reached the drawing process. This will include selecting an art style, using masks, and the overall process of making an illustration, that is, implementing all the things we've discussed earlier. First, we have to select an art style. This depends completely on you, but there are some things that you can consider. Rounded characters with more organic shapes can feel more cute and welcoming, while angular lines and geometric shapes feel less playful. Generally, you'll see people use warmer colors with organic shapes for more cute illustrations. Fun abstract patterns with a specific set of colors can tell a story too. Finding images or artworks or playing around with colors is a great way to try and make an illustration or background that suits your story. This can be a little tricky, but it's fun to play with. Personally, I feel textures or abstract patterns are the best way to convey emotions. Lastly, the amount of elements in your illustration matter as well. A messy illustration is a good way to show anxiety or something whimsical. In contrast, less elements can feel serene and lonely. Brainstorming ideas for your illustration can be fun, but it can get frustrating quick. So take your time, it doesn't have to be perfect. Following along in CSP, I'll explain how to use masks and mention some other ways you can make your process easier. I'll start by dividing it into the sketch, the line art, and then big shapes so that I can decide colors. I wanted a more distorted view, so I just used the fisheye filter here. Then I'm just laying out the bigger shapes. Using the liquify tool and guidelines, I fixed the perspective a little bit more. For the t-shirt, since the pink and the skin color were very close, I went with cyan, which was complementary to them. I also made the guitar black to balance out the black I'll be using for the hair for one of the characters. On to understanding how masks work. Say you want your drawing to be in a circular frame. You could simply erase the outside of the selection, but a more efficient way to do it is to make a selection and select mask. The mask will directly hide anything outside the selection. Or you could add a mask and simply erase the area you don't want visible. Now, if I change my mind and want the body to be visible once again, I can unhide it by using any brush, since the whole drawing is still there. I'm using a mask to block out the area outside the mirror. To clean it up more, you can go to Layer, Layer Mask and Show Mask. This will highlight the masked area so it's easier to fix it. If you want to copy a mask, you can copy it by dragging it onto a new layer while pressing Alt. For the skin, I selected the hair and masked that out. To invert the mask, just select it and press Ctrl I or Command I. Now, the skin will go over the bangs while the ears are still over the hair. When shading skin, use a darker, warmer tone for the blush and a cooler, darker tone for the shadows. This works for all skin colors without looking muddy. Instead of rendering, I'm only adding slight texture for shadows. I'm using a tone curve to adjust some of the colors. I'll be explaining this in detail later. It's a good idea to reuse colors and just evenly throw them around to tie everything together, like using a shadows color for the hair of another character. Finally, since the yellow felt a little uneven, I used it to make the illustration more bright. And we're done. On to the final section. For final touches, I want to go over color editing in CSP and using textures. In flat illustration or well in any illustration, these can really make the art pop and make it feel more put together. Since I was already happy with the original cover illustration, I only did some very minor color editing for that. So, for this part, to explain the color editing options in Clip Studio Paint, I'll be using another old illustration that looked a little bland. I'll be going over brightness, contrast, hue, saturation, luminosity, posterization, reverse gradient, level correction, tone curve, and color balance. Brightness and contrast are the easiest fix for this. Brightness increases the overall lightness of the image, while contrast adjusts the difference between the darkest and lightest colors. Here, I increase the contrast and decrease the brightness. This makes it pop more in comparison. On to hue, saturation, and luminosity. Hue changes the pigment. You can change the hue by adding a new layer as well and setting the blend mode to hue. Saturation is how colorful it is, and luminosity adjusts the amount of light. Posterization decreases the number of tones. Usually, I'll use this to make a palette out of the illustration and then input these colors into a random color scheme generator to find an additional color that will fit with the illustration. For example, you'll see it recommended me Maximilian Blue, which happens to be the color I used for the clouds in the background. After that, we have reverse gradient, which, well, inverts the colors. Color correction is a little more difficult to explain, so I'll skip this for now. On to my favorite one, tone curve. Usually, you'd want to have an S shape to bring out the tones and contrast without hurting the brightness. You can also adjust the redness, greenness, and blueness. You can play around with these and see what looks the best for your illustration. I tend to use masks to airbrush some of these to add dents and highlights. Lastly, we have color balance. It's similar to tone curve. You can adjust the intensity of the colors according to both RGB and CMY. It helps to make everything look more uniform or to adjust colors to an aesthetic. You'll see me make everything purple because I felt like that looked pretty neat. Finally, here are all the results to the different tonal correction options, starting with color correction, tone curve in red, green, and blue, and then them combined. Then we have level correction, hue, saturation, luminosity, and contrast, brightness. Before we get on to textures, I want to quickly mention some overlays. On a multiply layer, you can add any color as an overlay, but personally, I feel gradients do a better job, especially red and blue gradients. You can set the layer to multiply, overlay, or any blending mode of your choice, and then play around with the direction to see what looks best. In textures, my favorite is adding pearl and noise. You can select this through filter, render, pearl and noise. It adds a really nice realistic texture to the illustration. Clip Studio Paint also offers textures in its assets that you can use. They also have patterns that don't end for adding texture. Adjust these to your liking. Lastly, I would like to mention some ways to draw attention to a focal point. First one can be by adding color dodge. This can highlight important points very subtly. Then we have vignette. You can make your own vignette by airbrushing the corners with a dark blue or dark brown on a multiply layer. This will unconsciously direct the viewer's attention towards the center of the illustration. You can also have a similar effect by copying the layer and going to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Then you can just use an airbrush to erase the parts that you want in focus. And with that, we're done. I hope this tutorial helped you. All the links to the socials of the artists whose artwork I showed will be in the description. Thank you so much for watching.